So to begin, all right, is my screen showing? Okay, good. So this will be, we could talk for the next hour if we wanted about the archaeology of Beta Alpha, about the art history of Beta Alpha. There's so much there, but this will be a kind of a quick overview. And to start, I want to locate us about where this place is, where Beit Alpha is located within Israel. And so Beit Alpha is not terribly far south, but a little bit south of the Sea of Galilee, kind of in the southern extent of the Galilee region of Israel. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. The closest we get is probably in 1 Samuel and also 2 Samuel. There's a mention to Mount Gilboa, which Beit Alpha sits at the base of Mount Gilboa, which in the Hebrew Bible is the place where King Saul loses against the Philistines and takes his own life. Beit Alpha might appear in the Septuagint in the book of Judith, which was written during the Hellenistic period, so during like the 3rd, 2nd century BCE. And it might be mentioned as Bethulia, and Beit Alpha might be a derivation of that name, but nobody really knows. So Beit Alpha, unfortunately, does not appear, at least directly, in any textual evidence that we have. But what's interesting, in 1927-28, so before then, well before then, there was a kibbutz established in this area because of naturally occurring springs. It was a great area to grow crops. There was ample water supply. And so just like in the ancient period, there had been a village here. A group formed a kibbutz and re-established a settlement in the area. And while some of the members of the kibbutz were digging an irrigation channel for the fields, they came down on a mosaic floor. They immediately called the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who appointed the director of the archaeology program there, Eleazar Synagogue, who founded the program, came out with a team and spent 2 excavation seasons from 1928 to 1929 excavating the synagogue. And they uncovered a pretty large, a monumental building that measured kind of north to south. The synagogue isn't perfectly aligned north to south, but it's pretty close, 27.7 meters in length north to south, and then the width is 14.2 meters east to west. And there was a pretty spectacular mosaic floor. The first thing that the archaeologists found was a Helios zodiac cycle, which we will look at images and talk more about in just a moment. But this led to the question, is this a church or synagogue? Because when I say Helios zodiac cycle, I'm describing figured images that are contained within medallions within the middle of this mosaic floor. And Synagogue, in his excavation report, recounts almost in a, like as if he's keeping a journal, this debate that they had, that they're figured images, so it has to be a church. It can't be a synagogue. Well, the more that they uncovered, they determined this really doesn't fit anything, any other types of churches that have been found within this region. It has to be a synagogue. And also, there had been a synagogue excavated prior to this at a place called Na'aran in southern Israel that also had the first example of the Helios zodiac cycle within a synagogue. And I'll just go ahead and jump now to an image, and we'll be zooming in on all of these. So I know it's this is kind of zoomed out. This is an image that I was able to make. So after the Synagogue finished excavating, there was a large building built over the synagogue remains to protect them. And so that building still stands today. It's been updated, but you can go in and look at the synagogue remains. If you can get through this pretty cheesy 10-minute video that they show before you can actually walk around and see everything. But whenever I was working on my dissertation and doing research on mosaics and synagogues, I ran into the problem that there were no good aerial shots of any of these buildings, or a lot of the buildings didn't have great aerial shots. Ideally, I could have taken my drone and taken a few photos of the Beit Alpha synagogue, but there was a building above it which prevented me from doing that. And so luckily, there is a process which we'll talk about in just a minute called photogrammetry, which allows you to recreate a physical space in 3 dimensions. This technology has been used on a wide range of professions: archaeology, construction, dentistry, crime scene investigation. And so I was able to apply this technology to create a 3D model, and then from that 3D model, take an image from above that model, which is what you're seeing now. And so I want to jump in real quickly and give a quick tour of the synagogue. And again, we're going to be going in probably about 10 minutes and walking around this building. So I flipped this image on its side just to zoom it, make it a bit larger, so you can kind of see the tripartite division. That there's a scene around, there's 3 main scenes that are contained within this larger double border. One scene here, a second scene in the middle, which is the heliozodiac cycle, and then a 3rd scene at the top. But first, I want to discuss real quickly this inscription. And just to orient you again, up here where my mouse is north, this is south, and then east down here, and west up here. And so the entrance to the synagogue, or at least into this main hallway of the synagogue, of the basilica design, would be right in front of this inscription. And it's a dedicatory inscription that explains who laid this mosaic and when the synagogue was established. And most interestingly, there are 2 languages represented here: Greek and probably Aramaic. It might be Aramaic, it might be Hebrew. There is not enough to determine which language is being used, because the way it's represented, it could be either. But the Greek inscription reads, this is Sukenik's translation, may the craftsman who carried out this work, Marianus, and his son Hanina, be held in remembrance. Which is interesting because Marianus is a Greek name and Hanina appears to be a Hebrew name. And so we have people who both identify with Greek and Hebrew culture, or culture within ancient Israel, that are laying this actual mosaic, that we have the names of the people who laid the mosaic. And then the Hebrew inscription is very damaged, but it says that the synagogue was established during the reign of Emperor Justin. The bad news is there are 2 Emperor Justins. The good news is they reigned during the same century at least. They were separated by another emperor, but Justin I and Justin II both ruled the Eastern Roman Empire during the 6th century CE. So we know that this synagogue was established in the 500s at some point. So moving on to the next panel, I apologize for the low resolution. When we go into the model, it'll be a bit higher, but Google Slides won't let me import the really high resolution images because they were too large. But we have here a scene of the Akedah from Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, that we start to see some of the interesting choices that the mosaicists made. For example, the 2 servants that accompany Abraham and Isaac to the mountain, we see that the mosaicists decided they didn't really maybe know how to do layering and perspective within a photo or within a mosaic. And so this servant doesn't have a body, it's just kind of a head and floating arms. And in front of this servant is the donkey. So here we have Abraham tossing Isaac onto a lit altar, and we have the names inscribed, so Isaac, Abraham, and then we have the hand of God coming to stop Abraham from the sacrifice. And we'll talk about these more when we're walking around. I just want to give a brief tour now before we go into the model. And now this next slide was the theme for my dissertation, has been the focus of my research, the Helios zodiac cycle. And so Helios is the sun god and is the Greek god of the sun. And the according to Greek mythology, Helios would draw the sun across the sky in his chariot led by 4 horses. And so in the middle here, we have Helios wearing a nimbus with the sunlight pouring out of his head. We have the chariot with the 4 horses, and he's surrounded by elements of the sky. So we have stars, we have a crescent moon, and then surrounding the central medallion, we have the 12 signs of the zodiac, which whenever we're walking around, I'll point a couple of interesting things out. One interesting aspect, if you look, I'll get to that whenever we do the tour. But we have the 12 signs of the zodiac encircling Helios, and the zodiac are the 12 divisions of the night sky. We're mostly familiar with the zodiac because there are constellations that represent the zodiac. But in antiquity, the zodiac, and even today, if somebody's referring to the zodiac mathematically, it is the 12 evenly 30-degree divisions of the night sky that never really appear to shift from side to side, that whenever you go outside, you can draw a straight line between the moon and all the zodiac symbols. And if you can see the sun, you can also draw a straight line that would cut through the sun as well. But it's interesting that Sukenik and his team thought that first this had to be a church, because why would something like this be in a synagogue? Why would there be a representation of possibly a Greek deity in a synagogue? And there are reasons for that, which we can talk about when we're walking around. And then the top register, there's been a little bit of debate about this, that this is either considered a temple scene or a representation of the Torah shrine, that a lot of synagogues had Torah shrines that sat towards the front or in the apse that would have held the Torah scrolls and any other scrolls important to the community. And it would have looked exactly like this depiction here, that a lot of these have been discovered. And if you ever get a chance, you can even look these up online, but there are Torah shrines that you can see in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, or at least fragments of the architecture of Torah shrines. But this seems to be a type of hybrid where there is a Torah shrine that is meant to represent the Ark of the Covenant, because we see temple implements surrounding the scene, that there is an incense shovel, there is an etrog, there are lulavim, and there's also this curtain that's being drawn back, letting the viewer peek behind the curtain to see what was there. And we know, at least according to the Hebrew Bible, a curtain separated the Ark of the Covenant within the temple, Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And so that was a quick overview before we jump in. I also want to kind of give my sales pitch for why doing work like this is important, why 3D modeling is important. And so whenever I wanted to do research on things like this, on synagogues like Beit Alpha is one example, not terribly far away is another synagogue with a heliozodiac cycle at Sepphoris. And the synagogue where I work now with Dr. Magnus there's also a heliozodiac cycle there. That these are places, but since I'm only usually in Israel 1 to 3 months out of the year, I don't have constant access. And so doing this 3D modeling work allows us to revisit sites remotely. And also in archaeology, it's really nice whenever you can turn a site like Beit Alpha into an archaeological park, but more often than not, you have to recover everything you excavate, which is painful after you spend a month or 2 months digging all that dirt out. It has to be put back to conserve what we found for future generations, because not every site can be turned into an archaeological park. But this type of technology allows for us to be able to revisit sites even though they might be reburied. And it also allows for unique detailed analysis. And an example of this, another excavation where I work, the Ein Garndal Archaeological Project. After we had backfilled the site, we returned to the US from Jordan. About a month later, we realized that we had not taken measurements of a specific stone. It wasn't that important of a stone, but it should have been measured. But luckily, these 3D models now for highly detailed analysis, and I was able to hop back into the model, get a quick measurement of that stone, and because of the metadata attached to that model, it was within a tenth of a millimeter accuracy. And so we were able to do further analysis that we weren't able to do in the field. And then what's also significant about this is that these models can be incorporated into larger projects. So what we're about to do is take a step into one of these models and walk around. I've used a lot of these models for educational talks where students can walk around with me. That I have a 3D a virtual reality headset that I'm not going to torture you by putting it on and make you watch me walk around. But in the past, I've done that where students have joined me in this virtual environment, some with headsets, some just through their computers, but we're all able to collaborate in a single space together. And then another project that I recently submitted an article that'll be published hopefully in the upcoming few months. I was able to, thanks to another fellowship from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, fabricate a series of ancient oil lamps. And from those oil lamps, light the lamps, generate lighting data, and re-import that data back into 3D models. And so I was able to set the time of day, for example, like 8 p.m., where it was pretty dark outside. I was able to adjust the moonlight to be accurate, and then light a synagogue under potential lighting conditions to see if it was usable with how we expect oil lamps to have been distributed throughout the building. And I found out it wasn't the easiest, but it was bright enough at least to read. So you can navigate and also read if you strain your eyes slightly. So there's a lot of uses for this 3D modeling. And now we'll go into, I'm going to give you a few different options of how you want to engage with a 3D model. So there are only 24 people that are able to join me within the model. Anybody else who wants to walk around will still be able to join, but you'll have to be a spectator. And so there are 4 total ways that you'll be able to join me. The first way is I'll be screen sharing. So you can just watch the screen. You don't have to go in and walk around. You can just do that. I'll also be posting a high detailed image made from the 3D model that you can click on and look at on your own and ask questions about it. You'll still be able to see my screen share. The second way, I have this 3D model posted on a website called Sketchfab, where you'll be able to use a mouse to rotate, zoom in with your mouse wheel, or if you have a trackpad, pinch to zoom in, zoom out. And then the final way is you can join me and walk around the synagogue, at least the remains of the synagogue. And to do this, if you want to join me, we'll be using a platform called Mozilla Hubs. It's the same company that makes Mozilla Firefox one of the most popular web browsers. But once you join, just to give you a quick overview, I'll do this also again once we step inside the model. But you can navigate you can walk forward, backwards, and side to side using either your arrow keys on your keyboard, so up, down, right, left, or the keys W, A, S, and D. So imagine that the arrow keys are kind of transposed over the W, A, S, and D keys. And that will let you walk forward, backwards, and side to side. Now to turn your head, if you have a mouse, I would recommend plugging it in. If you don't have a mouse, you can use your trackpad. And I believe if you're on an iPad, you can join, and there will be a way for you to walk around. And I think you can move the iPad and it will move your head around for you. But I'll be posting these links in just a second, and we can jump into the model. And once everybody's where they want to be, if they're comfortable, and I give another quick navigation overview, I'll invite us to walk around and ask questions about what you're seeing and kind of jump into a quick a very loose Q&A. Any questions about the model, any questions about Beit Alpha, synagogues, and I'll point a few things out along the way as well. And so if I remember correctly, okay, here we go. And so that very first link is just to look at the image. That second link is to look at the 3D model. And the third link in the chat is to join the virtual space. And I will share my screen now. So if anybody doesn't want to join the virtual space, they can look at my screen. And so again, if I see that the beta alpha is filling up, that there are people joining, I'm putting everybody on mute within the model because it can cause an echo chamber having Zoom running while also having this model up, but normally you'd be able to talk using the model. And so again, to navigate, at least if you have a keyboard, if you're inside the model, use the arrow keys to move forward, back, left, right. You can use W, S, A, and D. And then to move your head, you left click with a mouse or a trackpad on a laptop, and you can move your head. If you're having trouble, if you don't have a trackpad or you don't have a mouse, you can also use the keys W and E, and I think it snaps your head in 15-degree increments. It's a little jumpy, as you can see on my screen, but it's doable if you're not able to move any other way. And so I'm going to move to the front of the synagogue. And there would have been more to the synagogue. Some of the foundation is built over, but this is, for the purposes of this talk, this is the entrance to the actual synagogue building, to the basilica, the main hallway. And if you notice, the first thing that you see is this, what's called a tabula insata, that there is the emblem with these two triangles pointing in towards the inscription, highlighting its importance. And we see up top, there's the Greek inscription, and just below it, we see the Hebrew or Aramaic inscription. And flanking this inscription are two animals. Directly above, we move to the scene of the Akedah, where we're starting to get a bit of a taste for the mosaicist style, that they're doing this elongated neck, which is, this style is pretty unique within the ancient world to this synagogue, that there are specific styles that exist in the ancient world that people imitate, but a lot of things that are seen in Beta Alpha are pretty unique to Beta Alpha. And then if you're looking at the image of the model, we have the zodiac coming up next. And a couple interesting things to point out about the zodiac, that the zodiac starts in the ancient world. Whenever the zodiac was drawn or inscribed somewhere, it would usually start on the right with the very first symbol of Aries, and then go counterclockwise, because that's the way that the sky appears to move, that the sun and stars move from east to west. And so when people depicted the zodiac, they would often depict it moving from east to west, starting with Aries and continuing to move counterclockwise. And in the corners, we have representations of the seasons, which were often depicted as, they're depicted in different pieces of literature at this time as four women, kind of the handmaidens of Helios, almost these angelic type figures, but in Greek literature. And the first thing that is surprising is that we would expect with Aries, Taurus, and Gemini down here in this upper right quadrant, in the relation of how I'm looking, we would expect to see spring, because those are spring zodiac signs. Those are representations of spring months. But in the top, we have winter. And so the seasons don't align with the zodiac. And some scholars have suggested, more so past scholars have suggested, this means that the people laying the mosaics and ancient Jews didn't really care for all this astrology stuff. They were just depicting things that they thought would make them more Greek. But I don't buy that, because there is a ton of Jewish literature from the past 500 years at the point where the synagogue was built that engages in pretty thorough analysis of astrology. And so what's going on here? There is not enough time to talk about everything. There would be an entire semester's course, but there have been a number of suggestions about what this might represent. One suggestion is that it could be calendrical, that this could just show a calendar, that the movement of time. And so in this interpretation, Helios is mainly just the sun, something that kind of moves time along. So it's a representation. One positive of that is this crescent moon. And any other time a crescent moon appears in a synagogue, it's a waxing crescent moon. This is a waning crescent moon, which is probably, I would argue, a mistake of the mosaicists, but normally that crescent should be flipped the other way. And if it was a waxing crescent moon, it would indicate the first day of the month, because of course, people in ancient Judaism, time was reckoned in a lunisolar calendar, that the moon was used to keep track of time. And so it might represent the beginning of the month. Another interpretation is that this is an angelic figure called Metatron, or possibly another angelic figure that is an intermediary. That Metatron, there are a series of books, 1st through 4th Enoch, and primarily 1st and 2nd Enoch, depicts, or and 3rd Enoch, the transition of the character of Enoch from way back in Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, who the author said was no more and walked with God, that this interpretation came about that Enoch ascended to heaven and became this angelic intermediary between the heavens and the earth. And so this could be a representation of that angelic figure or another. Or it could also potentially be a representation of God. One scholar has argued that this is a representation of God, that the groups of Jews who are making these synagogues are from multicultural backgrounds, and they're already depicting entities within the synagogue. And if you notice down here, the hands of God are already depicted. So why not depict God as Helios, the orchestrator of all time? Unfortunately, we can't jump back in time yet and ask Marianos what this represents, but there are a lot of possibilities. And then just to point a few interesting things out, let me peek at my notes real quickly. We have Libra over here, for example. Libra, holding the scales, is missing a leg. Again, we can see that the mosaicists didn't really know how to layer the depictions of what they were trying to depict. And then I believe, if I remember, Scorpio, let's count the legs of Scorpio. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That these people were probably familiar with scorpions, at least most likely had seen them, but for some reason they depicted a Scorpio containing extra legs, which are sometimes done in artwork to replace the claws, but they kind of smashed everything together in that one. And then, yeah. And so moving up, we don't have to talk a lot about this last panel again. It's a representation either of a Torah shrine, a temple scene, or a hybrid of the two. And this would have led up some stairs into the apse, which would have been a semicircular area where there likely would have been a Torah shrine holding scrolls. There is also a room, there's a set of stairs over here that led to a side room that is not preserved, and at least where the building where Beit Alpha, where tourists can visit. And so being able to work with models like this opens up a new realm of possibilities, especially in education. Not only does it let scholars revisit sites or possibly visit a site that they couldn't during a season, but it lets students engage and walk around and get a spatial awareness of an area that you just can't get from looking at a book. That I could show students pictures of the synagogue, but if you're not stepping inside and looking around, it's really hard to get a sense of the scale of the space. And this is largely sized accurately. It's a little, I made it a little smaller. It's about 0.7, it's about 70% of the actual size of the building, because originally when I made this, it was meant to be used in a classroom where several students would have headsets to be able to put on the headsets and transform a room into this synagogue. And the next steps for this project, I also, in addition to this synagogue and additional synagogues of Sepphoris, En-Gedi, some of Hukok, I have several synagogues where I've made models like this and also have made visualizations of what the synagogue may have looked like in the past. And so the next step for this project is to combine those to let people walk around and be able to toggle on that other model to see different depictions of what these buildings could have looked like. For example, did Beit Alpha have one story? Did it have two stories? What did the surroundings of Beit Alpha look like? Because unfortunately, there was not a lot of work done on the environs of Beit Alpha. So we don't know a lot about the actual village. But we do have the synagogue, and it does give us a really fascinating glimpse into this time of this late Roman Byzantine Empire period, the 6th century, of what was going on in the Galilee, at least in the construction of these monumental buildings. And so I want to open it up to any questions that people have about synagogues, about the model, about Beit Alpha. Feel free to unmute your mic and ask, or any comments.
So I have a question. Over here in like the corner of the tiling area, you can see that I can't tell if it's like he actually just messed up, but it looks like he did with like the cornering because it's like off. Is that just a simple mistake? Or is
Right,
that
so there are a lot of, so the mosaicists had to lay the mosaics based on how the foundation was laid. And so like, if you look at some of the images, another reason why I love photogrammetry is you can't really hide mistakes. That whenever I render that picture from the top, you can see that the mosaic is not a perfect square, that especially the further north you go within the main hall, that the line starts to skew outwards. And so there are a lot of areas where things don't really line up, but in the corner over there, there's probably two reasons for that. One, it's probably a place that was damaged just over time, and specialists came in and recreated that part of the mosaic so it would be able to stabilize the rest of the mosaic around. Or it could just be a flaw in the model. And I'll give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here, specifically with Beit Alpha. I had permission from the government, from the Israel Antiquities Authority, to do these models. And whenever I arrived, I was told that I would only have a minute every 15 minutes to go in and take photos. And so I would have to wait for the next group to shuffle in, wait for the 10-minute video to play. Then I would be given 60 seconds to run in, take as many photos as possible, and then come back out to the gift shop and wait until the next group came in, watch the video, then I could run in. And so this model was not made under the best circumstances. It was 3 hours of waiting with only actually like 12 trips inside. And during it, my modern Hebrew is not the best, and I was trying to explain to the people who were running the video and light show, they were trying to make the area brighter for me to take photos. But with photogrammetry, you need a constant source of light and not changing lighting, not a lot of changing in the lighting. And so there are areas of this model that aren't perfect because of the way I had to do the photograph. So that corner specifically is either due to a repair made by specialists, by conservators who came in, or it's something wrong with the actual model. And if I was going to be using this to make a big academic argument, I would probably take this on my iPad and go back to Beta Alpha and see, so I could highlight it and make sure people would know that, hey, there's a mistake that I made in the model.
Brad, I have several questions in the chat.
Oh, let me.
So Bob asked, was there Geniza discovered? And what do you think was the layout of the Moses seat, the scroll table, and the Torah cabinet? Barbara wants to know whether it's open to visitors. Anne wants to know whether there was a mikveh at the site. And I stop here, and then we go to Avril.
Okay, so first up, there was no Geniza found at the site, no seat of Moses. None of those things were found at the site. Not to say that they didn't exist, but this building probably fell out of use and people came in and might have taken whatever they needed. If things were made out of marble, for example, they might have taken it for other purposes. And so those things, as far as I know from the reports that I've read, unless there's a report somewhere that I haven't had access to, that none of those items were found with this synagogue. And what was the next question? Oh, and as far as the layout, there would have been, the Torah shrine is expected, would have been up in the apse, kind of as a reflection of how it looks in the mosaic. But I can't say that. There's no evidence of that. That's pure speculation. And it's how things might have been elsewhere, but we just don't know. Okay, I see the chat now.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, the site is open to visitors. You can show up and go. I think it costs the equivalent of like $10 US. If you go, there are beautiful springs that you can go and relax by afterwards. So this is a beautiful, beautiful area to visit. So I'd highly recommend taking a trip. The Beta Alpha can be kind of hard to find. It's not located correctly on Google Maps. So just don't be afraid to roll the window down and ask somebody if you wind up going and you can't find it.
And there was a question about the name. Why Beta Alpha, or how the?
So Beta Alpha it's a modern name, but there's a couple, it might come from this reference in Judith, from Judith 4:6, which was written in Greek, called Bethulia. Or it might also come from the name of a rabbinic sage who I think was named Ilpha. But there might have been a tradition of one of those names that was passed down and eventually became Beta Alpha, but nobody really knows. It's just what it's been known for hundreds of years, and so that name was just kind of adopted. And then as far as a mikvah, there's no evidence of a mikvah on site because mikvah weren't needed to go into a synagogue. That mikvah were to purify you to go before divine presence. And at least as far as we know, there was no divine presence believed to reside within the synagogue, that the synagogue wasn't a house of God. Sometimes we do find that places like, especially the early synagogue, like Gamla, there is a mikvah, several mikvahot nearby, but mikvahot might appear close to synagogues because the synagogue is a public building where the community can gather. And so where would you put a resource that you wanted the community to use, probably close to a public building. And so even though there were no mikvaot discovered around the synagogue, doesn't mean that they didn't exist. But again, they may only be close by because it's meant to be a public resource and not required to go into the synagogue in antiquity.
I think a good question is about the large stones.
Right. And so we see here, I'm trying to find an area. And so this is, if you go to the model on Sketchfab, it's a lot higher resolution, but I really had to bump the resolution down to allow everybody to walk around it. There are some areas. So the stone, I'm having a hard time finding them, but the stone on the inside would have been completely plastered. And on top of that plaster, there likely would have been paint, but we don't have evidence of paint at Beit Alpha, but there are other contemporary synagogues that have floral designs. There are designs kind of like red squares that are trying to imitate the way that things were being decorated at this time. And so the inside and all of these columns would have been completely covered in plaster to give it a much cleaner, crisper appearance. Yeah, and so this, I'll need to go back and look at the excavation report, but the Islamic period in Israel, there aren't, at least with these synagogues, there's not widespread destruction of anything, any of these buildings. That a lot of these buildings fell out of use and burned down from what appears to be natural causes. And so it might seem surprising that this wasn't destroyed, but people in this region, at least for a while, lived in harmony. And so we see these buildings still being constructed, even though as early as the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there are new laws being written from Rome forbidding the construction of new synagogues. All up until the 4th century, these are laws that no new synagogues can be constructed. But why will somebody in Israel, even though if they are a Roman citizen, obey laws coming out all the way from Rome? But it seems like people kind of, as long as they could get along, they could largely abide by their own sets of rules. And so we see these synagogues being built in a time where actually the empire was forbidding their construction. Right, and so above the zodiac sign, there are Hebrew words. So here, for example, if you can see like my screen, or if you come up to the top right, we see for Taurus the word shore. And so it's identifying the zodiac according to Hebrew terminology.
I think we have 2 questions about why it's not so beautiful.
Oh, yes, I should also say that when this was discovered, they also cut out sections for preservation and then put them on display, and it became an exhibit that people could visit. And then they put them back into the ground, which if you go to Hamat Tiberius is a good example that in the past 10 years, it was destroyed by a radical group who took sledgehammers to the mosaic. And the conservators who were able to rebuild it, you can't tell where the breaks took place. So they did such a good job of putting it back and blending everything together. But of course, this was back in the 20s and 30s where sections were cut up and then reinstalled. And so you'll definitely see some of those lines.
Yeah, and Avril has the questions about the why the mosaics are so weird looking, especially compared to other nicer mosaic floors in synagogues. And I mean, thinking of Hukok, I would say I probably have the same question.
Yeah, this feels like a choice.
Right. And so there's a couple reasons. It could be a stylistic decision, which is, and let me start by saying we don't know. We can't go back and ask the people, so we don't know. One, it could be a stylistic decision. Two, there could, Marianus and his son might have been not like from this area probably, but local to the region or known in this region, and they wanted this family specifically to work on their synagogue. Another reason is this is all that they could afford, or maybe a lot of the people didn't travel widely enough to know what the stylized mosaics looked like elsewhere that only a set amount did. And so for them, this would have been the most beautiful thing ever. And we're looking at it through modern eyes, of course. And so we're judging these things. I kind of joked about working with layering and omitting some aspects, but based on some of the stylistic decisions that were made or some of the restrictions that the artists weren't able to do, that people trained in known mosaic schools were able to do, especially the layering, we can get a better idea that these mosaicists were absolutely trained, but maybe not at one of the best schools. That it's not clear if they went to a place to learn how to do this or if they were taught it as a trade.
And I would think there's a really good last questions. How long do you think it would have take to build such a synagogue?
Oh, good question. And I don't have an answer. I wish I had an answer. I wish I knew. It all has to do with how many people were constructing the foundation, the mosaics after everything went out, plastering, having any type of instruments used within the synagogue, if anything that was gilded. But it would have been a little while, but I don't know if that means a year, 2 years. If anybody else who's part at the lecture has a better estimate on that, please feel free to speak up.
Yeah, and Brett, maybe you can put the your information, how you can be reached into the chat so that people can follow up with questions, because I can see that there's already some more discussion going on in the chat. And if you're interested in also other programs of the center, just go and visit our website, and we'll have our next event on March 1st. So go there and check out. And Tina has just put in the link to this event.